There is a photograph from 1931. A man sits in a Chicago courtroom wearing a silk shirt and pearl gray spats. His jowls are powdered white to hide something. 3 scars run down the left side of his face. He is smiling for the cameras, but his eyes tell a different story. In a few hours, a jury will decide his fate. Not for the murders everyone knew he had ordered, not for the blood that soaked the streets of Chicago for nearly a decade, but for something far quieter, for numbers in a ledger, for money he never paid to the government. His name was Alphonse Gabriel Capone. The newspapers called him Scarface. He called himself a businessman. And the federal government called him something else entirely, public enemy number 1. But tonight, I want to tell you a different kind of story. Not the legend that Hollywood has told 1,000 times. I want to tell you about the quiet moments, the unanswered questions, the strange contradictions of a man who fed the hungry and murdered the inconvenient. A man who ruled an empire of violence and died unable to remember his own name. This is the story of Al Capone, and like all true stories, it does not end the way you expect. The story begins not in Chicago, but in Brooklyn, in a tenement building at 95 Navy Street in the shadow of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The year was 1899, and the neighborhood was filled with the sounds of 1,000 immigrants trying to survive. Gabriele Capone was a barber. His wife Teresa was a seamstress. They had arrived from Italy 6 years earlier from a small town called Angri near Naples. They would have 9 children. Alphonse was the 4th. The neighborhood was rough. Different streets belonged to different groups, and a boy learned quickly which blocks were safe and which were not. The Irish controlled the areas near the Navy Yard. The Jewish gangs held Williamsburg, and the Sicilians, well, they were known for their efficiency with a knife. Young Alphonse was by most accounts a good student. He earned decent grades through the first several years of school. His teachers saw promise in him, but something changed around the 6th grade. His attendance slipped, his marks dropped, and then at 14 years old, he hit a female teacher in the face. He never went back to school. What happened in that classroom? What made a promising student throw everything away in a single moment of violence? The records do not say. The teacher's name has been lost to history. All we know is that after that day, Alphonse Capone began a different kind of education. He worked odd jobs around Brooklyn, a candy store, a bowling alley. He set pins and swept floors and tried to be what his parents wanted him to be. But there was another world operating alongside the legitimate one, and it was watching him. A man named Johnny Torrio ran a criminal enterprise in the neighborhood. He was not loud or flashy. He preferred negotiation to violence, at least when possible. And he saw something in the young Capone. Perhaps he recognized a certain kind of intelligence, a willingness to do what others would not. Torrio became a mentor, and under his guidance, Capone began to move through the street gangs of Brooklyn. The Junior 40 Thieves, the Bowery Boys, the Brooklyn Rippers, each one a step further into a world that offered something the legitimate economy did not: opportunity. He was 19 when he received the scars. The story varies depending on who tells it. What is generally agreed upon is that Capone was working as a bartender and bouncer at a place called the Harvard Inn in Coney Island. He said something to a woman, or perhaps he said something about a woman. Her brother, a man named Frank Galluccio, took offense. 3 cuts across the left side of his face, deep enough to scar for life. Capone would later tell reporters the wounds came from combat in France during the Great War. It was a lie. He never served in the military, but the scars gave him a nickname he despised and a fearsome appearance he would learn to use. In 1918, he married a young Irish Catholic woman named May Coughlin. She had just given birth to their son, Albert Francis, whom they called Sonny. Capone was still under 21, and his parents had to sign the marriage certificate. By all accounts, he loved May. He would remain married to her until his death, even as his criminal empire expanded to include gambling, bootlegging, and prostitution, even as he became one of the most powerful and feared men in America, even as disease consumed his mind and left him unable to recognize his own family. But that was all still to come. In 1920, Capone received a summons from his old mentor. Torrio had moved to Chicago years earlier, working for a man named Big Jim Colosimo, who controlled the city's brothels and gambling operations. Prohibition had just begun, and Torrio saw an opportunity that Colosimo did not. The 18th Amendment had made the manufacture and sale of alcohol illegal across the entire United States. It was supposed to create a more moral nation. Instead, it created the largest criminal opportunity in American history. Torrio wanted to expand into bootlegging. Colosimo refused. And then, in May of 1920, Big Jim Colosimo was shot dead in the vestibule of his own restaurant. No one was ever charged with his murder, but Torrio took over his criminal empire, and one of the men who benefited most from that transition was the young enforcer from Brooklyn. Capone started as a bouncer and worked his way up. He managed brothels and gambling operations. He learned how the organization functioned, how money moved, how politicians and police could be persuaded to look the other way. And then in January of 1925, Johnny Torrio was nearly killed. Members of a rival gang, the North Side Gang, ambushed him as he returned from a shopping trip. He was shot multiple times but survived. When Torrio recovered, he made a decision that would change the course of American criminal history. He handed the entire operation to Al Capone and retired to Italy. Capone was 26 years old. What followed was a period of violence that shocked even a nation accustomed to gangland warfare. According to the Chicago Crime Commission, there were more than 700 gang-related murders in the Chicago area between 1919 and 1933. The homicide rate in the city rose by more than 20% during Prohibition. And at the center of much of this bloodshed was the organization now led by Capone. His rivals were eliminated one by one. Sometimes they were shot in the street. Sometimes they disappeared without a trace. Establishments that refused to buy his liquor were sometimes bombed. According to some historical accounts, as many as 100 people may have died in such explosions during the 1920s. But here is where the story becomes complicated, because even as Capone ordered violence, he was also feeding the hungry. During the Great Depression, it was Al Capone who opened some of the first soup kitchens in Chicago. Thousands of people lined up for meals provided by the most wanted criminal in America. He made donations to charities. He tipped generously. When he attended baseball games, the crowds cheered. How do we understand a man who could do both? Who could order a murder in the morning and feed the poor in the afternoon? The historical record offers no easy answers. Perhaps he was genuinely moved by the suffering around him. Perhaps it was calculated public relations. Perhaps both things can be true at the same time. The most famous act of violence attributed to Capone occurred on the morning of February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day. 7 men were gathered in a garage at 2122 North Clark Street on Chicago's North Side. The garage served as a headquarters for George Moran, known as Bugs, who led the North Side Gang. Moran's organization was one of the last significant rivals to Capone's dominance. According to witness accounts and the subsequent investigation, 4 men arrived at the garage that morning. 2 of them were dressed as police officers. They told the 7 men inside to line up against the wall, as if conducting a routine raid. The men complied. They had dealt with such raids before. And then the gunfire began. 2 Thompson submachine guns and at least 1 shotgun. More than 70 rounds were fired. When it was over, all 7 men lay dead or dying against that brick wall. The victims included Adam Heyer, Frank Gusenberg, Pete Gusenberg, John May Al Weinshank, and James Clark, all members or associates of Moran's gang. There was also Dr. Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist who apparently enjoyed the company of gangsters. Bugs Moran was not among the dead. According to some accounts, he arrived late and saw what appeared to be police cars outside. He decided not to enter. When reporters asked Moran who was responsible, his answer was simple: only Capone kills like that. Reached at his home in Florida, where he had been at the time of the massacre, Capone offered his own response: the only man who kills like that is Bugs Moran. The case remains officially unsolved to this day. No one was ever charged with the Valentine's Day massacre, but the investigation that followed revealed something important. Several months later, a man named Fred Burke was stopped by a police officer in Michigan after a traffic accident. Burke shot the officer and fled. When police raided his home, they found weapons and stolen bonds. Forensic examination of the weapons determined that they had been used in the Valentine's Day massacre. Burke was a known associate of Capone's organization. He was captured, tried for the murder of the Michigan police officer, and sentenced to life in prison. He never admitted involvement in the massacre and died in prison in 1940. The massacre shocked the nation. Photographs of the crime scene were published in newspapers across the country and around the world. The public image of gangsters as romantic outlaws began to change, and the federal government, under newly elected President Herbert Hoover, began to take a more aggressive approach. The problem was jurisdiction. Most of Capone's crimes fell under state and local law, and the Chicago police seemed unable or unwilling to build a case against him. His relationships with local politicians and law enforcement provided protection that seemed impenetrable. But there were two areas where federal authorities had clear jurisdiction violations of prohibition laws and income tax evasion. A young prohibition agent named Elliot Ness was assigned to lead a team targeting Capone's bootlegging operations. He assembled a small group of agents who could not be bribed, a notable accomplishment in an agency known for corruption. The newspapers called them the Untouchables. Ness and his team raided breweries and destroyed stills. They documented the scale of Capone's bootlegging empire. Their efforts cost the organization millions of dollars and provided evidence of widespread prohibition violations. But the case that would ultimately bring Capone down was built not by Ness, but by accountants. Frank Wilson was a special agent for the Internal Revenue Service's intelligence unit. His job was to follow the money. For years, Capone had operated without maintaining bank accounts, without owning property in his own name, without signing checks. He paid for everything in cash, leaving no paper trail. But Wilson and his team were patient. They interviewed witnesses. They examined records from businesses associated with Capone. They pieced together evidence of income that had never been reported to the government. In 1927, the Supreme Court had ruled that income from illegal activities was still subject to income tax. This gave the government a weapon that did not depend on finding witnesses willing to testify about murders or intimidating victims into coming forward. In June of 1931, Capone was indicted on 22 counts of tax evasion for the years 1925 through 1929. He was also charged with conspiracy to violate prohibition laws based on evidence compiled by Ness and his team. Capone tried to negotiate. He pleaded guilty and offered to pay his back taxes in exchange for a light sentence. The judge rejected the deal. When the trial began in October, Capone arrived in silk shirts and expensive suits, surrounded by reporters who treated him like a celebrity. One journalist asked about his weight. Another asked about the shade of blue of his hat. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was different. The prosecution presented witnesses who testified about Capone spending his gambling income, his lifestyle that could not be explained by any legitimate source. A letter written by Capone's own tax lawyer attempting to negotiate a settlement years earlier was admitted as evidence. In that letter, Capone had essentially admitted to earning unreported income. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. On October 17, 1931, Alphonse Gabriel Capone was found guilty of tax evasion for the years 1925 through 1929. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the harshest penalty ever imposed for tax evasion up to that point. He was also fined $50,000 in order to pay $30,000 in court costs. Capone was 32 years old. He would never regain his power. He began his sentence at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, where his influence and money initially bought him comfortable accommodations and special privileges. But in 1934, he was transferred to a new facility that had been built specifically to hold the nation's most difficult prisoners. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary sat on a rocky island in San Francisco Bay. It was designed to be escape-proof, not just because of its walls and guards, but because of the cold, treacherous waters that surrounded it. And it was designed to be influence-proof as well. Prisoners at Alcatraz received no special treatment, no matter how much money or power they had possessed on the outside. Capone arrived as inmate number 85. He was given a cell assigned work details and stripped of the privileges he had enjoyed elsewhere. Other inmates reportedly did not treat him with the deference he had once commanded. According to some accounts, he was stabbed by another prisoner at one point and required medical treatment. But something else was happening to Al Capone, something that would prove more devastating than any prison cell. Years earlier, when he was still working in the brothels of Chicago, Capone had contracted syphilis. The disease was common in such environments, and treatments at the time were unreliable. Capone apparently never sought adequate medical care, possibly out of shame, possibly out of fear that word would spread. For years, the disease had progressed silently, but by the mid-1930s, its effects could no longer be hidden. Neurosyphilis is what happens when the infection spreads to the brain and nervous system. It causes a gradual deterioration of mental function. Memory fades. Behavior becomes erratic. The mind that once controlled a criminal empire began to fail. In February of 1938, Capone was formally diagnosed with syphilis of the brain. He spent his final year at Alcatraz in the hospital section, confused and disoriented. His wife May petitioned for his early release, arguing that he was no longer capable of functioning in normal society, let alone returning to criminal activity. He was paroled in November of 1939, having served less than 8 years of his 11-year sentence. He was 40 years old, but his mind had deteriorated severely. Medical evaluations concluded that he had the cognitive function of a 12-year-old child. Capone went first to a hospital in Baltimore for treatment. The Johns Hopkins Hospital reportedly refused to admit him because of his reputation, but Union Memorial Hospital agreed to provide care. In gratitude, Capone donated 2 Japanese weeping cherry trees to the hospital grounds. Then he retreated to his estate on Palm Island in Miami Beach, Florida. He had purchased the property years earlier during the height of his power. Now it became a kind of exile. In 1942, after penicillin began to be mass-produced in the United States, Capone was among the first patients to receive the new antibiotic as treatment for syphilis. It slowed the progression of the disease but could not reverse the damage already done to his brain. For the remaining years of his life, Capone lived in seclusion with his wife and family. According to accounts from those who knew him during this period, he was sometimes lucid and sometimes lost. He might not recognize relatives who came to visit. He might ask the same question repeatedly, unable to retain the answer. There are stories of him fishing in the swimming pool at his estate, convinced he was catching something. Stories of him mumbling to himself about enemies who were long dead or had never existed. The man who had once inspired fear across an entire city now inspired only pity. On January 21, 1947, Capone suffered a stroke. He developed pneumonia. 4 days later, on January 25, 1947, he died of cardiac arrest. He was 48 years old. His body was transported to Chicago for burial, though the family tried to keep the arrangement secret to avoid crowds of the curious. He was interred at Mount Olivet Cemetery and later moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, where he lies near other members of his family. And so the story ends. Or does it? Because there are questions that the historical record does not answer. Questions that still linger nearly a century after the events that made Al Capone infamous. The Valentine's Day Massacre was never solved. We have theories, we have forensic evidence linking certain weapons to the crime, we have confessions that were never acted upon. But no one was ever convicted. No one stood trial. The families of the 7 men killed that morning never received the closure of a verdict. Who actually pulled the triggers? The most common theory points to Fred Burke and other associates of Capone's organization, possibly including members of a St. Louis gang called Egan's Rats. But theories are not convictions, and the men most likely responsible are long dead. Did Capone order the massacre? Almost certainly. He had the motive, the means, and the organization to carry it out. He was conveniently in Florida at the time, establishing an alibi. But ordering and proving are different things, and the proof was never assembled. How many people died because of Al Capone? Some historians estimate between 300 and 700 directly or indirectly, but these are estimates, not firm counts. Many deaths were never recorded as gang-related. Many bodies were never found. The true number may never be known. And what about the money Capone reportedly earned as much as $100 million during the height of his power, an almost unimaginable sum in the 1920s? Where did it go? His estate when he died was relatively modest. His family did not live in luxury after his death. There are persistent rumors of hidden fortunes of cash buried or stashed away. In 1986, when the Lexington Hotel in Chicago, one of Capone's former headquarters, was being renovated, a live television special was broadcast as workers tore down a wall to reveal what was supposedly a hidden vault. 30 million people watched. The vault was empty. Perhaps the money was spent. Perhaps it was lost. Perhaps it never existed in the quantities the legends suggest. Like so much about Al Capone, the truth remains elusive. What are we to make of this man, this story, this legacy? He was a product of his time. the neighborhoods of early 20th century Brooklyn, where immigrant families struggled for survival, the corruption of Prohibition-era Chicago, where politicians and police were for sale, the violence that seemed for a time to be the only path to power. He was a monster by almost any measure. The murders he ordered, the lives he destroyed, the suffering he caused cannot be excused by the soup kitchens he funded or the charities he supported. And yet he was also human. A son, a husband, a father, a man who loved opera and baseball and expensive clothes, a man who was capable of loyalty and cruelty, generosity and savagery, charm and brutality. The disease that consumed his mind in the end was perhaps a kind of justice, though a slow and terrible one. The man who had terrorized a city spent his final years barely able to recognize his own family, a prisoner not of iron bars, but of his own deteriorating brain. His legacy lives on in ways both obvious and subtle, in the mythology of organized crime, in the laws that were passed in response to the violence of his era, in the photographs that still circulate, showing a man in a fine suit, 3 scars on his face, a smile that reveals nothing. But I think what haunts me most about the story of Al Capone is not what we know, but what we do not know. The crimes that were never solved, the victims whose names have been forgotten, the truth that lies buried somewhere beneath the legend. There is a garage on North Clark Street in Chicago. It was demolished decades ago, but some of the bricks were saved. 300 of them are now displayed at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. You can still see the bullet holes. The bricks remember what happened there, but they cannot tell us who pulled the trigger. They cannot tell us why the case was never solved. They cannot tell us if justice was ever truly served. And that perhaps is the most unsettling thing of all. Not the violence itself, but the silence that followed. The questions that remain unanswered. The gaps in the story that no amount of research can fill. Al Capone died in 1947, but his story in some ways never ended. It continues in the questions we cannot answer, in the mysteries we cannot solve, in the darkness that still lingers at the edges of history. And if you listen closely late at night, you can almost hear it still. The echo of gunfire in a garage, the silence of a city that looked the other way, the slow, quiet breathing of a man who could no longer remember the blood on his hands. Some stories have endings. This one just fades into shadow.